A billionaire walked into her diner just before closing time. No smile, no small talk, just a black coffee and silence. But when his wallet slipped open, something fell out. A photograph of a woman Grace hadn't seen in years. Her mother. A black woman who'd never known power, never claimed wealth, but whose face now lived in a stranger's pocket. Why was her mother's photo inside the wallet of one of the richest men in America? And why did he act like it meant nothing? By the time the coffee cooled, Grace Turner's life had already changed. She just didn't know it yet. The night had settled deep over the small town. A stillness hung in the air, one only the late shift ever knew. Inside the diner, a flickering neon sign outside cast a faint red glow across the linoleum floor. Grace Turner moved quietly behind the counter, wiping down the same spot she'd cleaned an hour ago. Not because it needed it, but because the silence left too much room for memories. Her mother's laughter, the smell of cornbread from the oven, the way the house always felt a little too big after Helen passed. Then, the bell above the door jingled. Grace looked up. She expected the usual, a tired delivery man, maybe a nurse finishing her shift. Instead, in walked a man who didn't belong. Tall, white, late 60s maybe. His suit looked hand-stitched, Italian, the kind of tailoring you didn't see much around here. Certainly not in diners open past midnight. He stood still for a second, scanning the room like he owned it. Then, with quiet purpose, he walked to the booth by the window and sat down. His pale blue eyes locked on the street beyond the glass. Grace grabbed her pad, heart ticking a little faster. Something about him felt heavy, like a memory you didn't know you still had. "Evening," she said softly. "What can I get you?" He didn't look up. "Black coffee," he replied, voice low and steady. No warmth, no smile, just command. She nodded and turned away. She'd served folks like him before, men used to being obeyed. But there was something else underneath. An ache, maybe, or a secret. When she returned, coffee in hand, he barely acknowledged her. She placed the cup gently in front of him. He reached into his coat, pulling out a wallet so sleek it looked untouched by time. Then, a photograph slipped loose. It drifted, almost slowly like time wanted her to see it. It landed face up on the floor. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She knew that face. The soft smile, the gentle strength behind the eyes. It was Helen Turner, her mother. For a second, everything else faded. The diner, the coffee, the man in the suit. It was just that photo, and the question tearing through her chest. She bent down, picked it up with trembling hands. Where did you get this?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper. The man's head lifted, and for the first time he truly looked at her. Their eyes locked. Hers filled with shock, his unreadable. Grace held out the photo, her voice rising. "Why do you have a picture of my mother?" A flicker crossed his face, too fast to name. Then he reached out and gently took the photo from her hand. "You're mistaken," he said quietly, slipping it back into his wallet like it meant nothing. Grace's heart thundered. "No, I'm not." She had seen that photograph every day growing up, tucked inside a small wooden box under Helen's bed. She could trace every crease with her eyes closed. "I know that photo," she said. "I know her." The man stood. He placed a crisp $100 bill on the counter without looking at her. "I don't owe you an explanation," he said. He turned and walked toward the exit. Grace's body moved before her mind could catch up. "Wait," she called out, rounding the counter, nearly tripping on a loose mat. The man didn't stop. Outside, a black car waited. A driver in a cap opened the rear door. "Please," Grace called again, breathless. "Just tell me how you knew her." He paused, one hand on the car door. The street lamp caught the edge of his silver hair. He turned slightly, his expression distant, detached. "Forget this," he said. Then he stepped inside. The car pulled away, and the night swallowed the sound. Grace stood frozen under the neon light, the street empty again. Her breath came in shallow bursts. He was gone, but her mother's face had been in his wallet. And nothing could explain that, not yet. But Grace Turner was going to find out. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Grace sat at her kitchen table, elbows resting beside an old laptop that whirred louder than it worked. A half-eaten piece of cornbread sat untouched on a plate. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, searching for something, anything. She didn't have a name, no receipt, no business card, just his face, his voice, and the photograph she wasn't supposed to see. The coffee from the diner still lingered in the back of her throat. Bitter, cold, like the silence he left behind. She began typing, "Older white billionaire real estate New York." A flood of names appeared, magnates, developers, politicians. None of them felt right. She clicked photo after photo until one image made her stop breathing. A headline read, "Charles Whitmore expands global holdings to 5 new cities." She clicked, and there he was. That same distant gaze, that same silver-gray hair. Only now, flanked by executives in tailored suits. Her chest tightened. It's him. Charles Whitmore. A billionaire. A man whose name was on skyscrapers from San Francisco to Atlanta. But none of the articles said anything about Helen Turner. No past relationship, no scandal, no hint of connection. Why would a man like him carry that photo? Unless he'd gone out of his way to erase it. Grace's fingers curled slowly against the table edge. He had looked her in the eye and denied everything. As if her mother had never existed. As if she didn't matter. She closed the laptop. Her mind wasn't foggy anymore. It was clear. She needed answers. And she wasn't waiting for someone else to give them. The next morning, Grace stood at the corner of 5th and Hamilton, staring up at a tower of glass and steel. Whitmore International Headquarters. People in polished shoes and sharp blazers rushed past her. None of them looked twice, but Grace stood still. In one hand, she held a folded photograph, her mother's copy, pulled from the memory box that morning. In the other, a heart that beat faster than she cared to admit. She walked inside. Cool air met her skin. Everything smelled like money, new leather, filtered air, floor polish. At the front desk sat a young woman with perfect posture and a practiced smile. "I need to speak with Charles Whitmore," Grace said, trying to keep her voice steady. The woman barely glanced at her. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Grace admitted, "but it's important." "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore doesn't take unscheduled meetings." Grace had expected that. She looked around. Security guards stood near the elevators, sleek badges scanned at the turnstiles. Every entrance guarded, no way in, not the normal way. Then she saw him, a young man, maybe mid-20s, balancing a laptop and 2 paper cups. He wore a badge. He was distracted, rushing. Grace stepped toward him. "Hey," she whispered, falling into step beside him. "You forgot to send me that summary Charles needed this morning." The man blinked. "What?" she sighed, exasperated. "The memo. He asked for it before the executive call." He hesitated. Just long enough. She matched his pace. As he scanned his badge, she slipped through the turnstile beside him. The security guard barely looked up. She was in. The elevator doors opened. She pressed the button for the top floor, her reflection staring back at her in the mirror finish. This was it. No apron, no coffee cup, no more wondering. Grace Turner was going to look Charles Whitmore in the eye, and this time he wasn't walking away. The elevator doors slid open. Grace stepped onto a floor that didn't look like it belonged to the same building. Everything was quiet. Walls paneled in warm wood, thick carpets that muted every footstep. A receptionist in a navy blazer looked up as Grace approached. "Can I help you?" "I need to see Mr. Whitmore," Grace said, her voice even. The woman tilted her head politely. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Grace replied, "but he'll want to see me." The receptionist offered a tight smile. "Mr. Whitmore doesn't take walk-ins." Grace took a breath. "Tell him, my mother's name was Helen Turner, and I'm not leaving until he speaks with me." The woman paused. Her fingers hovered over the phone. Then slowly she dialed an internal line and murmured into the receiver. Grace waited. Each second stretched like thread pulled too tight. Then, a door opened at the end of the hall, and there he was. Charles Whitmore. No suit jacket this time, just a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled. He looked older than he had the night before. More real. More tired. He didn't speak right away. But something shifted in his face. Not surprise, not anger. Resignation. He nodded once. "Come with me." She followed him down the hall, past framed photos of city skylines and magazine covers. Each one shouted success, but Grace kept her eyes on his back. Inside the office, the door clicked shut behind them. Silence settled in. Charles walked to his desk. He didn't sit. He reached into a drawer, pulled out the same wallet from last night, opened it, and laid the photograph on the desk between them. Grace stared at it, the crease across the corner, the faint smudge near the edge. Her voice was quiet. "You knew her." Charles didn't flinch. "I didn't just know her," he said at last. "I loved her." Grace's breath hitched. She had braced for denial, for lies. But not for this. Charles leaned back against the desk. His hands gripped the edge, knuckles pale. "I met Helen in the summer of '85, he said. "I was supposed to be helping scout new developments. She worked at a church near Baton Rouge. We talked every day. At first about nothing, then about everything." His voice drifted. "I used to sit in the back row just to hear her sing during rehearsals. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that it was just a moment, but it wasn't." Grace's hands curled into fists. "Then why did you leave?" Charles looked away. "Because I was a coward." The words hung in the air. "My family made it clear, if I stayed with her, I'd lose the business, the inheritance, everything." Grace's jaw clenched. "So you chose money." His eyes darkened. "I thought I could come back, after I'd secured my future. I told myself she'd understand, but by the time I returned, she was gone." The ache in his voice was real. But Grace wasn't ready to let it soften her. "She never told me about you," she whispered. Charles closed his eyes. "Because she was trying to protect you. From me." A long pause settled between them. It was the kind of silence that says more than words ever could. Finally, Grace turned toward the door. "I need time." He didn't try to stop her. Didn't reach out. Just nodded. Grace walked out of that office without looking back. But her thoughts stayed behind, circling the man, the photograph, the truth that had cracked open everything she thought she knew. And that night, she opened the memory box, looking not for closure, but for something she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. It was nearly midnight when Grace pulled the old wooden box from the closet shelf. She hadn't opened it in years. The hinges creaked softly as she lifted the lid. Inside, the things her mother had never quite let go of. A church bulletin from 1987, folded in half. A dried magnolia bloom wrapped in tissue. Letters, photos, bits of ribbon and string that meant nothing to anyone else. But to Helen Turner, they'd been anchors. Grace sifted gently, her fingers brushing the edges of memory. Then, she found it, tucked at the very bottom, a small velvet pouch no larger than her palm. She opened it carefully. Inside was a delicate silver necklace, its chain smooth with age, its pendant simple, oval, slightly worn at the edges. She turned it over. 3 words were etched on the back. "Forgive, love, begin." Her breath caught. She remembered seeing this once, years ago, dangling from her mother's hand at the edge of a bedtime story. But Helen had tucked it away, said it was for later. And now it was later. Also inside the pouch was a small, faded photograph. A man in a white shirt standing on a grassy hill beside a laughing Helen, younger, lighter, happier. Grace didn't have to guess who it was. She'd know that profile anywhere now. Charles. A folded note slipped from beneath the photo. Her mother's handwriting, looped and steady, filled the page. "This belonged to your father. I kept it for you. One day, you'll understand." Grace's fingers trembled. The truth wasn't just out there now. It had always been here. Quiet, waiting, wrapped in velvet and written in her mother's hand. She pressed the necklace into her palm, its weight unfamiliar but grounding. For a long time she sat still. The room was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Outside, cicadas sang into the night. Inside, a daughter met the ghost of her mother's past and saw it for what it really was. Not just loss, but choice. Helen Turner hadn't told her everything, but she had left her something. Not just a truth, but a decision. The next morning, Grace stood once more in front of Whitmore International. This time, she wasn't sneaking in. She walked through the revolving doors with the necklace in one hand and the letter folded tight in her pocket. At the desk, the same receptionist looked up, surprised. "I need to see Charles Whitmore," Grace said, voice steady. The woman frowned. "As I've said," Grace placed the necklace on the counter. The engraved words caught the light. "Then tell him his daughter is here." Everything stopped for a moment. No noise, no movement. Then, the woman reached for the phone, and across the lobby, 2 security guards approached. Grace didn't move. Then, a voice, deep and clear, broke through the stillness. "Let her in." Charles stood at the far end of the hallway, his expression unreadable, but he was looking at her. And he hadn't turned away, not this time. Charles didn't speak as Grace followed him down the hallway again. But this time, her steps were different. Not rushed, not afraid. She walked like someone who carried answers. Inside his office, he closed the door gently. No lock, just air thick with something neither of them could name yet. Grace didn't wait. She placed the necklace on the edge of his desk. The pendant faced up, the words "forgive, love, begin," silent, steady. Then she unfolded the note, laid it beside the necklace. "This was hers," she said. "Actually, it was yours." She kept it. Charles stared at the objects like they were pieces of another life, one he'd left behind and never expected to see again. His fingers hovered above the pendant, but he didn't touch it. "She kept it," he murmured, almost to himself, like it was something too fragile to believe. Grace's eyes didn't leave him. "She never told me your name," she said softly. "Never showed me this photo, but she left this. For me." Charles reached for the chair behind his desk but didn't sit. His hands gripped the backrest instead. White-knuckled. "I didn't know," he said. "If I had known she was pregnant, if I had known about you." His voice broke there. Not in sound, but in rhythm. The way regret folds into silence. "I might have come looking," he said. "Sooner. But I didn't, because I thought I had time." Grace nodded slowly. "You didn't know, because you left." Charles winced. "I searched for her," he said, almost defensively. "Years later, I hired people, asked around, she was gone." "She made sure of it," Grace said, her voice tightening. "She was protecting me." Charles didn't argue. "She didn't think you deserved to be in my life," she added. And for the first time, he didn't deflect, didn't explain. He just stood still. "Maybe she was right," he whispered. The office went quiet. Outside, the city pulsed. Cars, buses, sirens, schedules. But inside, time felt like it had stopped breathing. Grace looked down at the necklace again. Her thumb ran over the engraving. "She left me this to decide," she said. "To choose whether I wanted to know you, not as a name on a building, but as a man." Charles looked up, and for a brief second, he looked younger. Not in face, but in the way his sorrow reached out past pride. "I can't change what I did," he said. "I was afraid. And I let that fear decide my life." He paused. "But I'm here now. If you ever want to know me, not as Charles Whitmore, but as a man who made a mistake he'll never stop regretting." His voice faded. "I'll be here." Grace stood still. She didn't speak, didn't cry. She just looked at him, searching. Not for apologies, not for excuses, but for truth. And in his silence, she finally heard it. Grace reached for the pendant. It felt cool against her skin, heavier than she expected. She clasped it around her neck with slow, careful hands. The chain settled just below her collarbone, a quiet weight, like the past finally had form. Charles watched. "She never stopped thinking about me," he said quietly. Grace nodded, her voice tight. "She never stopped protecting me." He closed his eyes just for a second, as if that truth stung more than any accusation ever could. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said. "Not a threat, not a wound reopened, just fact." Charles nodded. "I understand." Grace turned toward the tall windows behind his desk. The city stretched beyond the glass, endless and moving, a world that had kept going while hers had paused. "I thought I knew who I was," she said. "I thought I understood my mother, my story. But you changed that." Charles stayed silent, not out of avoidance, but respect. She turned back to him. "I'm not asking for answers right now, but I needed the truth, and I think, somewhere in her own quiet way, my mother wanted me to hear it." She tapped the pendant gently. "Forgive, love, begin. That's not a demand, it's an invitation." Charles's throat tightened. His voice, when it came, was softer than before. "If there's a day when you want to talk, really talk about anything, I'll be here. No pressure, no promises, just here." Grace studied him. He didn't look like a titan of industry now, not a billionaire, not a name on the side of buildings. Just a man, graying at the temples, shoulders slightly hunched, waiting for something he'd never dared to hope for. And maybe that was enough. For now. She stepped back, not out of anger, not out of fear, just space. "I'm not ready," she said. Charles nodded. "But I'm not walking away either." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the photograph. Her copy from her mother's box. She placed it gently on his desk, beside the other. Two versions of the same memory, side by side, like they'd always been waiting to meet. She didn't need to say anything else. Her footsteps toward the door were slow, deliberate, not heavy, not rushed, just hers. She didn't slam the door, didn't look back, because forgiveness doesn't live in what you say. It lives in what you leave open. That night, Grace didn't go home right away. She walked, past the bus stop, past the diner, still glowing under the hum of neon. She walked until her legs ached and the city thinned into silence. Eventually, she sat on a bench outside an old park where her mother used to bring her as a child. The trees were thinner now, the benches repainted, but the stillness felt familiar. She looked down at the pendant resting on her chest. Forgive, love, begin. 3 words. No promises. No instructions, just a path, one she could take or not. She let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. This wasn't a story about fairy tale reunions. There was no movie ending waiting just around the corner. Her mother had loved a man who chose a different world, but she'd never stopped protecting Grace from that choice, not out of shame, but out of love. And now that love had given her something more valuable than any inheritance. It had given her the power to choose, to forgive on her own terms, to love if she was ready, to begin when she felt it was time. The next morning she returned to the diner, her regular apron, the same cracked coffee pot, the same seat by the window. But something inside her had changed. She wasn't a woman chasing answers anymore. She was a woman who had found one. Not all of them, but the one that mattered. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like half of anything. At the end of her shift, she reached into her pocket, took out the old photo again, looked at her mother's eyes, and whispered, "I understand now." She didn't need Charles Whitmore to fill in the rest of her story. But if he wanted to sit across from her one day, no walls, no secrets, she wouldn't stop him. Because some stories don't end. They change shape. And Grace Turner, she wasn't standing in the shadow of her mother's past anymore. She was standing in her own light. And maybe that's the lesson her mother wanted her to learn all along. What would you have done if you were Grace? Would you have walked away? Or left the door open? If you believe she should give him a second chance, type 1 in the comments. If you believe some doors should stay closed, type 2. We're not just telling stories, we're listening to yours. This is Mia, and we'll see you again with another story that still echoes in someone's memory.